If you got a bulletin on the way in, there's an outline in there. I would invite you to grab that and grab a Bible or the Bible up on your phone. We're going to look again in the Gospel of Luke. It's kind of fun to be around little kids, see so many of them here this morning. Kids learn so much, and at times, when you talk with them or you're teaching them, you can just watch their little brains working and processing all of that, of whatever it is that you're talking about. But anybody who is a parent knows that being a parent can be intimidating, especially when they start peppering you with questions. I remember there's an old story told about a dad who was out for a walk one afternoon with his 5-year-old son. And as kids often do, at that age, maybe especially, the questions started to flow like a stream, Questions like, Dad, why is the sky blue? And, of course, Dad had to answer, son, I really don't know the answer to that one. Dad, where do clouds come from? And again, son, never figured that out myself. Dad, how does electricity travel through those lines? And on and on and on the questions came one after another, to which every single time the dad could only say, son, I just can't say, I don't know the answer to that. And finally the little boy asked, Dad, do you mind me asking all these questions? To which the father responded, why, of course not, son. How else are you ever going to learn anything? You do only learn by asking questions, but we all know that sometimes questions directed towards us don't come with the innocence of a child. Some questions are verbal attacks, and I hope that you haven't had to deal with any of that lately. But I thought of that this morning because Jesus definitely did. The last week of his life, Jesus, especially on Tuesday, especially in the passage we're going to look at this morning, had to fend off some verbal attacks. In his last interaction with the religious leaders of Jerusalem prior to his arrest, it involved question after question after question that were intentional to try and trip him, try and trap him. And Jesus, as you would expect, his responses are brilliant. But I want to look at some of those questions upon questions with you this morning. So if you've got a Bible, the Bible app on your phone, find Luke chapter 20. And we're going to be starting in verse 20 together in our study today. Last Sunday, being Easter, we covered the end of the Gospel of Luke, how the whole story ends. During my devotionals sent out the week prior, we covered the content of Luke 22 and 23. But we did skip over a couple chapters in our year-long quest in the life of Jesus as researched and recorded by Dr. Luke. And so over the next few weeks, I want to go back and fittingly finish Luke's Gospel. I was thinking about this morning. Some of you might wonder, well, why have we taken a year and a half to work through one book in the Bible? One reason is because I want to model how the best way is to study the Bible. I realize that a lot of the time we tend to, if you use just a devotional or whatnot, we tend to view the Bible just in sound bites. What's the verse for today? What's this one little piece that I can take and use today? And there's nothing wrong with that. But God didn't write the Bible in sound bites. God wrote the Bible in books like Luke and letters like you find at the end of the New Testament and history books like you find throughout the Old Testament. And that's the way he revealed truth to us. And the best way to gain the most from what God wrote to us is to read it the way he wrote it. And so, it's taken us a year and a half, but we've worked through every piece of the Gospel of Luke by the time that we're done. Didn't skip over anything. Some passages are easier to talk about, right? Last Sunday, it was one of those passages. Easter is a wonderful message, and maybe it's kind of easy to outline. But some passages, like what we're going to look at today, you might think, how does all this fit together? And if I was going to study the Bible, I'd probably just read through this and not pause too much. But it's really important truth. God included it for a reason. And so what we're going to look at today is some of those questions that took place on the Tuesday of Passion Week, where we find ourselves in Luke 20, is that Tuesday. It's the final full day of interaction by Jesus with the crowds and with the religious leaders. And Luke records what happens. I want to start back a verse, so verse 19, give some context. It says, the teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he'd spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, it's kind of interesting that Luke chose to use the word spies in his description of these questioners that had arrived that day. It's the only time in the New Testament that word is used, but it's kind of fitting. The religious leadership, starting in verse 19, on this Tuesday, they wanted to try something to trap him, and so they decide to use a stealth approach, sending in people to watch, to look for some way, maybe to throw some flattery his way, which is part of this question as well, but then to attack with a question. And you know this from personal experience. There are some questions that people ask of you, or maybe even that you ask in your own life and in your own thinking, that are important. And then there's questions that matter more than that, And I think this section we're going to look at today breaks down in those ways. There are some questions that matter, and one of them is this: should we pay our taxes? Should we pay our taxes? I won't ask for a poll this morning how you answer that. Well, let's see what Jesus had to say. The agenda was pretty obvious. They wanted to find some way to ensnare him with his words, and so these spies asked this question: "Teacher, is it right for us to pay our taxes to Caesar?" Now, on the second weekend of April, seems like a rather appropriate question for all of us to think through as well, right? If you haven't done that yet, Tuesday's the deadline. I'm kind of glad that the question was not, should we want to pay our taxes? Because I have a definite opinion about that one. But it was not that. It was asked, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now just think about the scenario. If he said no, then they would slip that information to the Roman governor. Hey, there's this guy who's got a whole crowd following him, and he's telling people they shouldn't pay the taxes. Maybe you should look into that. If he said yes, it is right to pay taxes to Caesar, the crowd would be disappointed because they all hated the Romans. They all hated, April 15th. They hated the constant need to be feeding more of their hard-earned cash to Caesar. It seemed like a no-win situation. So Jesus turns the table. In verse 23, it says, "He saw through their duplicity and said to them, 'Show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription are on it?' 'Caesar's,' they replied. He said to them, 'Then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.'" They were unable to trap him in what he said there in public. Astonished by his answer, they became quiet. I hope you can sort of picture this whole thing unfolding. Being asked this loaded question, Jesus didn't pull a denarius out of his own pocket. He asked them for one. "Show me one of those coins." And one of the spies had one handy. A denarius was a coin with the emperor's image stamped on the side. It amounted to 1 day's wage for the common laborer, and it was the only coin that could be used to pay the poll tax, which every person was required to pay. If these guys were all fired up about paying this tax and Jesus asked them to show them a denarius, you'd expect them to say, well, we don't carry those. We refuse to carry Caesar's money on us. And yet one of them had it. Oh, yeah, right here. A little bit of hypocrisy in that. But Jesus' question is, whose face is on that coin? And the answer is obvious. Well, it's Caesar's stamped on the side there. It's Caesar's face on the coin. And his statement is just so profound. Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But he didn't stop there. If that was all he said, that would have been a pretty strategic answer. But he didn't stop there. He said, and also, give to God what is God's. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Hang on to that. Their trap didn't work out the way that they had hoped. Jesus had answered the question, didn't fall into either ditch on either side of the road. He navigated that one right down the middle. And it's not too hard for us to apply his answer for us today. The answer is Yeah, fill out your 1040 by Tuesday and submit that to Uncle Sam. Pay what the government says that you should pay. Use as many deductions as you possibly can, though, to not have to pay any more than you have to. Pay the taxes to the government that you rightfully owe. But don't let that be your main concern in life. Don't let that be your main concern. Because it's a question that matters. But there's other questions that matter more. Here's another one. I word it this way from verses 27 down to 40. What is resurrected life going to be like? Verse 27. Some of the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to Jesus with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman and died childless. The second and then the third married her, and in the same way the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now then at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Now, as Luke states in verse 27, the Sadducees were a faction of the religious hierarchy who did not believe in the resurrection. They only held to the first 5 books of the Old Testament scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, Genesis to Deuteronomy. And it might sound weird to us, because maybe we don't interpret or think this way, but they were a group that rejected any belief in the supernatural. And so the Sadducees did not believe in angels, they did not believe in miracles, and they did not believe that there was life after death. The Pharisees did, but the Sadducees did not. This past week I read Josephus was a first century historian, not a Bible writer, a Jewish historian, secular person. And he wrote about the Sadducees. These are his words. The Sadducees take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul, teaching instead that souls die with their bodies. Basically what the Sadducees believed was this life is all you get, and when you die, it's over. They were Jewish leaders. And that's what they held to. That's what they believed. A lot of people today believe that same thing. This is all you get. There's nothing else to it. But realizing that was their perspective, that was their understanding, their theological mooring, does add some color to their question, because they bring this absurd situation to Jesus, intending to make him look foolish, intending to make him jump through their hoops. But again, it just doesn't work. The question is based on a small notation in Deuteronomy 25. It's verses 5 and 6. Describes what has been called a Levirate marriage. And what that verse, the focus of that was on keeping the family tree alive to inherit the family property. And they took that and they presented this ridiculous scenario of a woman who's married. Her husband died before they could have children. And then the widow marries the next brother, but he dies before they can have any kids. The next brother marries the widow, and he dies. And the next, all the way down to brother number 7. It's absurd, it's ridiculous. Because around brother number 4, that guy would be saying, no thanks, lady, what I mean? You're on your own. We're not going down that road. But they wanted to create this absurd situation to try and trap Jesus. And the question is, well, in the resurrection, which they did not believe that there was, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? And Jesus sees right through that. He knows their agenda. And this is how he answers, verse 34. Jesus replied, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they're like the angels. They're God's children, since they're children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise. For he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For to him all are alive. Some of the teachers of the law responded, well said, teacher. And no one dared to ask him any more questions. Now, I know we tend to gravitate to the topic of marriage in the next life, and Jesus answered there. For most of us, the most meaningful relationship in life now has been with our spouse, and it seems kind of odd to read what Jesus said there. But I worded the question the way that I did because that really was the main point. Jesus' focus was not on marriage in the afterlife, but on the reality that there is such a thing as life after this life. That there is life after death. Resurrection is true. Resurrection is promised. And though the Sadducees denied it, Jesus knew it is true. You do not cease to exist when you die. And Jesus makes that case from the scriptures they would accept, the first 5 books of the Bible. He goes to the burning bush story, and God describes himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, in the present tense. Right then, he was their God. They had died, but they were still very much alive and will one day have their bodies resurrected as well. That was Jesus' main intention. That was the main thing to combat their disbelief and life after death. But in the process, he does say some things about marriage and the next life. Marriage for the purpose of having children, which was the point of the Levirate marriage line there in Deuteronomy 25, will not be needed in the next life because people will no longer die. The world will be fully populated with those that have been born from the beginning of time through the end of time. And no more children will be arriving. Now that's different. That's different from the way we experience life right now. But it gives us a glimpse into eternity. Like I talked about last week, we'll be the exact same people that we are today, but with perfect bodies, in different bodies, equipped for eternal existence. It'll be much the same, but different. And that trickles out in different ways. And it affects even marriage. But I think this is really important. It's important to underline this. That Jesus does not say, he does not say that the family that you love and that you're a part of right now will be non-existent in eternity. He doesn't say that. Jesus does not say that husbands and wives will not know each other or have a close relationship like they have here on earth. He does not say that the loving relationships you know now will just vanish in the next life. He doesn't say that. He simply says that in the resurrection, there won't be any more weddings or giving birth to any more babies. Because people will become like angels. And if you remember last week, not that people will become angels, but become like angels. In this way, one clear regard, we will not even face the potential of dying. That part is long gone. And our focus for eternity will be on being what we sang earlier, being children of God. That relationship will take center stage, pleasing our Heavenly Father in the way that we go through life. That will be the most important piece of our existence. Now, I think it's really important to grasp this, especially because the culture that we live in really minimizes marriage. Jesus was not minimizing marriage. Not at all. God designed marriage for us and stresses the importance of it throughout the Scriptures as one of God's primary institutions in this world. And marriage is one of God's greatest blessings in life right now. I clipped an article last summer, and I sometimes just snap photos so I can go back and find something as an illustration later on. And I clipped this last summer from the news, an article about Hubert and June Mallicoat. I think that might be how you'd say it. But anyway, last July, these two celebrated their 100th birthdays. They were born like 10 days apart from each other. And they celebrated their 100th birthday along with 79 years of marriage. And like the title says there, Hubert and June met in church. They put it on the thing, Happy Couple Fell in Love, during a church service. And it was fun to read. This couple, Hubert was asked how they both made it to 100, and he said, we just kind of live by day, and all of a sudden you're 100 years old. And, really that's how it happens. One day at a time you get to be 100. But it was neat to read how they celebrated with friends and families at the same church where they met in back all those years before. But I'd kept that picture since last summer in my illustration file and decided to use it this morning. So I thought I'd go back and research it again, And when I went back to follow up on the story, I discovered that both Hubert and June, who were born 10 days apart in 1922, died last December. And they died within 20 hours of each other, less than 1 day apart. Totally different reasons or whatnot, but they died within 20 hours of each other in December. It's kind of sad, but it's also seems rather fitting, doesn't it? Nearly 80 years together, and they stepped through the doorway of death within a day. And I read a story like that, and I have to think that Hubert and June know each other today and will be forever a part of each other's lives. I think it was Alistair Begg. I don't know if you ever heard Alistair Begg. He's a Scottish brogue. He pastors a really big church in Ohio. But he was talking about this section that we were studying about marriage and the resurrection. And it just always, it stuck with me. He mentioned in that classic, accent that he had recently said to his wife, Susan, "I know there's no marriage in heaven, but when we get there, can I sit by you?" I feel the same way. And I think we need to be careful about reading negatives into Jesus' words here. He intended it to counter the opinion that there's no such thing after this life, that when you die, it's done. And that's not true. That's not true at all. Jesus said there is life after death. Sure, relationships will be different to a degree, but your relationship with God will be so expansive, so much more important, so real for all of eternity. In a new body, in a new place, a new heaven, and eventually a new earth. It's more than what we can really wrap our heads around. And yes, I believe with the people that you love. Now, those two questions are important questions. A certain degree, maybe they might seem like, good answers to theological answers to wrap your heads around, practical. Yeah, I should pay my taxes. Yeah, there is life after this life. But there's other questions that matter more. And that's how this kind of ends. And that's where I want to go with you as we close. Some questions matter a lot more. And this is the first one. What do you believe about Jesus? That's a question that matters more. Verse 40 concluded with a statement that nobody dared ask him any more questions, so Jesus started asking them. It says in verse 41, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David?' David himself declares in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.' David calls him Lord. How then can he be his son?" Jesus' questions directed towards them focus on the perspective of the experts, the perspective of guys like the Sadducees, like the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, their perspective on the identity of the Messiah, and as a result, their belief about his own identity, who he was. And to get at his question, Jesus quotes Psalm 110. Psalm 110 was written by David. It's by the Jews, accepted as a messianic psalm. This is all about the promised Savior, the promised Messiah. In Jesus' day, they assumed that was about the Messiah. And I think maybe the best way to get at this is for me just to read Psalm 110. It's short, so you can turn there if you want, or you can just listen along. David wrote this, Psalm of David. "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle, arrayed in holy splendor. Your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb. The Lord has sworn will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. He will judge the nations, heaping up the dead and crushing the rulers of the whole earth. He will drink from a brook along the way, and so he will lift his head high." Now, if you read through and you think about that song that the Jews sang about the Messiah, their understanding of what the Messiah was going to do, you can see pretty clearly why the Jews assumed the Messiah was going to be a military leader, a conquering ruler. I put some of the phrases up here. I will make your enemies my footstool. The Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion. Zion was a term for Jerusalem. And so the rulership was going to flow out from Jerusalem. Troops will be willing to fight on the day of battle. The Lord is at your right hand and will crush kings. And then he says it again at the very end. He will judge the nations, crushing the rulers of the whole earth. Everything in there feeds to the narrative that the Messiah was going to be a military conquering king, that he was going to reign forever over the whole earth. And that is what the Jews expected. But there was one part that was overlooked. And Jesus takes his highlighter and says, what about that first line? What about that first line? How could the Messiah be a son of David but also be the Lord of David? The answer was that this descendant of David, who would be the king of the world, was also the Lord over all. They didn't understand fully that Jesus came not just as a human conqueror, but as the Son of God, the eternal creator and Lord over all. He was in Jerusalem that week. Remember, this is the last week of Jesus' life. He was in Jerusalem that week to accomplish a much bigger mission than Psalm 110 explains. He was there to provide spiritual victory. He was there to provide spiritual deliverance for everyone who would believe. The questioners, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those tossing verbal attacks, trying to trap him and trick him, they did not accept him as the Messiah. They rejected Jesus. They would not believe. But that didn't change his identity. He was the promised Messiah. And one day, what Psalm 110 writes about, well, one day that will take place. Jesus is coming back. And all of that will happen exactly like the Jews sang about. One day he will rule over the world in a literal way from Jerusalem. But the first time he came, the first arrival provided a more necessary deliverance. And that would happen 3 days later. On Good Friday, God the Son gave up his life as a substitute. He died on the cross. He endured the wrath of God over the sins of the world. He suffered everything that he did that day to free us. Free us from sin, to make forgiveness possible, to obtain the reality of life after death for everyone who will believe in him. And that question, what do you believe about Jesus, is the most important question for any of us to answer. And so I put it out there. What do you believe? What do you believe? Many people, even those that might wear the label of Christian today, have a rather self-oriented and shallow perspective of God. I read an author recently who said this: many have left the biblical definition of who God is. They've redefined him to be somewhat like a big genie in the sky who wants them to be nice to others, will help them when they're in trouble, and wants them to be happy. Think about those 3 lines. Big genie in the sky. He wants them to be nice, will help them when they're in trouble, and wants them to be happy. That's kind of the way the world looks at it. If there is a God, that's what he's like, right? When I'm in trouble, I can ask for help. He wants me to treat other people nicely, and he wants me to be happy. That's the biggest goal in life. It's rather self-oriented and shallow view of God. God is so much greater than that. God is eternal, God is perfect, God is holy, and God is loving. He created everything, including you and me. He has authority over our lives. He made everything perfect. And then mankind, starting with Adam and Eve, and then everybody else followed along, broke the perfection that he created. We messed it up with our sin nature and our personal choices to sin. And God hates that. God hates sin. and we all deserve his punishment. But God also loves people. He loves you. And that's why Jesus was here 2,000 years ago. That's why God the Son came here to pay the penalty your sin, my sin deserves. He died so we could be forgiven. And only God could do that. Only God. Only God could do that. Neil Shenvi, in his book, Why Believe, he wrote this. All his life, Jesus had taken our place. He fulfilled the law that we should have kept, loving God and loving his neighbor. Jesus perfectly kept the rules. He never failed in any of those things. He fulfilled the law. On the cross, he took the punishment that we deserve, bearing our sins and enduring the wrath of God. The story of salvation is the story of exchange. Jesus takes our sin so he can have his righteousness. Jesus bears our curse so we can have God's blessing. Jesus, the Son of God, is treated like a rebel so that rebels like us can be accepted as sons. What a great explanation. Because of Jesus, and only because of Jesus, I can be a child of God. You can be a child of God if you choose to believe in him. But I come back to the question, have you? Is that what you believe? Have you chosen to place your faith in Jesus alone? That is the question that matters most. A lot of good questions. That's the question that matters most. And in this passage, there's one more. There's one more I want to get to, and that's this. Another question that matters a lot more. How and in what ways are you honoring God with your life? The end of the chapter, it starts verse 45, I guess. I'll get there. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, beware the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes, love to be greeted with respect in marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues, the places of honor at the banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. Jesus points to the religious leaders, the guys like the Sadducees, that just kind of toss those verbal attack questions his way. He says, don't be like them. It's just all for a show. It's not real. They like the honor they get. But you turn the page to the next chapter, and Jesus holds up a very different model. Chapter 21, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow who put in 2 very small copper coins. And listen to what he said. Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people, they gave their gifts out of their wealth. She, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. The rich were making noise, hey, look at me, look how much I'm putting in the offering, drawing attention how generous they were in giving to the temple. But this poor widow woman put in just 2 small copper coins. Basically nothing that could change the bottom line for the church budget. And yet Jesus noticed her. Jesus honored her. And the reason was, in the very end, she gave more than everyone else because she gave her all back to God. The amount given didn't matter as much as the amount she had left after she had given. This woman gave God everything. And I do think that brings this whole passage together and sort of takes it all full circle. Because you remember that first question? The whole discussion about paying taxes. You remember Jesus' rebuttal? Then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And what came next? But give to God what belongs to God. If we really grasp who Jesus is, what Jesus did for us, we will realize I owe him everything. I owe him everything. Not just my money, not just 10% on Sunday, not just a token to come and sit in church. I owe him everything. My life, my energy, my focus, my time, my priorities. If we really grasp who Jesus is and what he did, we realize we owe him everything. And it's a really fitting question to end with. How and in what ways are you honoring God with your whole life and all that you do? There's always a pull to prioritize the lesser important issues, the lesser important questions. The pull of our culture says, that matters more. Look over here. Focus on this. This is a big hot topic right now, whatever. There's always something to be distracted by in the world in which we live. The pull is constant, and peer pressure is often not the best thing. Some of the old timers might remember this, but back in the 40s and 50s, there was a television show that I have seen reruns of because I'm not that old. I'm old, but not that old. But it was produced by Alan Funt. It was called Candid Camera. They've done reboots of it over the years. Sort of the first reality TV show, I guess. But the genius was it just caught people in the act of being themselves. And produced a lot of laughs, but also a fascinating look into the way people think. And in one of the original series, there was an episode titled Face the Rear. And when an unsuspecting person, would board an elevator, and how you go in an elevator, and what do? You naturally turn around and face the door, right? Face the front. That's how you got in. That's how you're going to get out. And so they would have cameras set up in this elevator, and a person walks in, faces the front, and right at that moment, then 3 actors walked into stepped into the elevator, and all 3 faced the rear. And hidden cameras in the elevator sort of captured the angst of the person being pranked in this. All 3 people are facing the back. The pressure, to go along with everybody else. And finally, there would be a 4th actor, that stepped in and also faced the rear. And without exception, every single one of those individuals then turned around and faced the rear too. The social influence, people, affected them so much that they faced the rear even when they knew in their heads, this isn't right. There's no way this is right. But everybody else is doing it, so I'm going to do it too. It's funny on a TV show, but it's not funny when you realize the same thing can happen spiritually. The same thing can happen spiritually. In fact, I think happens spiritually all the time. And with these last couple questions, it's so important that we don't let the influences of our world, the influences even of people in our lives, cause us to not take those questions seriously. I would not want any of you to miss out on eternity with Jesus because you succumb to the pressure of not responding with authentic faith. Because you're concerned about what somebody else might think, what your friends might say, or anything else. Ask that most important question. What do you believe about Jesus? What have you done with what he did for you? Have you put your faith in him? If not, I hope today you do. I hope today you do. But I also would not want any of you to regret the reward in eternity that could have been yours if you lived a life more focused on honoring God right now than all the stuff that our whole world says you ought to live for and chase. So easy to focus on other priorities, other pursuits. And that last question, how am I honoring God in the way that I live? It dials in on that concern. And I would encourage you, ask it. The way that I put the ending here on this is to just simply pause to say, what are your answers? Not what is the right answer, not what is the answer that I know the pastor wants me to give. What are your answers? What are your answers to those 2 most important questions? Because the top couple questions, they're valuable. They give us good information. The bottom 2, though, affect eternity. They carry eternal implications. And I want you to think about it. how would you answer them in your life? This morning, we're just going to close in a word of prayer. And so I'm going to ask you to stand with me. And I'm going to take just a moment of silence. And then I'm going to pray. I'm going to head home. Father, I am deeply thankful for your love for every one of us. I'm deeply thankful that Jesus came here. The Son of God came here to rescue me, to rescue every one of us who would believe. But I'm reminded through this passage and through the whole crux of the message of Scripture that we have to do something with that. We have to respond to that. We have to respond to what Jesus did on the cross with our personal faith in order to experience the forgiveness and the eternity and the eternal life that he wants to give every one of us. And I pray that everyone here today would think about that for themselves. I know that probably every person here could give the right answers. But only you know, and only they know, if their hearts are actually changed. If they have authentic faith and they are personally trusting in Jesus for their deliverance and their eternity. If not, I pray today would be the day they'd settle that. But I also am reminded through this that being a follower of Jesus Christ, becoming a child of God, it does not just change the destiny after I die. It changes the way that I live right now. It ought to. And that second question is so valuable, so important. How about me? How about every one of us? In what ways do we honor God in the way we go through Monday afternoon, in the way that we live the average week, and what we say at school, in our workplace, the things we do with our money, the things that we do with our time? How does it show that we're honoring you? And is there some way that this week we could honor you more? Those questions really matter. And Father, I pray we take them along. We take them into the week in front of us. We would remember them. We'd maybe percolate on them a little bit this afternoon. And we'd answer them in ways that will shape forever. Because of Jesus. In his name I pray.